controllers, go for landing. Retro. Go. I don't go. Guidance, go. GNC. Go. Econ. Go. Control. Go.
Ninth Planet Audio.
Capcom, we're go for landing. You're go for landing, over.
Change happens to people in lots of different ways. For Annie Wilson in 2002, as an 8th grader attending the Cullowhee Valley School in North Carolina, it happened with a mascot.
I remember going on a school field trip to the university library, and they had a display at the library about indigenous symbols used as mascots, like the Chiefs and the Redskins and the Braves, all of that. And so that, I think, is really where my interest in this started. And then I started cheering and noticing other mascots in our region that were cool, like the Eagles and the Mustangs.
Right.
Why do we have a gross old man as our mascot?
You already know what I'm going to say, right? Big white mustache, big hat, gray coat. Yes, the Cullowhee Valley School where Annie Wilson was in middle school were the Rebels.
I remember complaining to my parents about that, and then them helping me kind of connect those dots with, those kind of indigenous mascot symbols and the Rebel. And so I was the president of the student council, and I decided this is something that I want to do. I want to change as my mascot.
Annie wrote a letter to her local newspaper, the Silva Herald and Ruralite.
To the editor, I recently visited an exhibit at the Western Carolina University Library
depicting the use of Native American names, symbols, and imagery in sports teams' mascots. This was a very interesting and thought-provoking experience for me. I never realized these seemingly innocent and even positive icons on a deeper level can be very degrading and damaging to the culture on which they are taken. Then I started to think about my own school's mascot, the Rebels. I have attended Cullowhee Valley School my whole life. I am now in the 8th grade, president of student council, and a cheerleader. I have therefore been closely associated with our mascot. I have worn the image on my clothes, drawn it on my notebooks, and so forth. But I've now started to wonder if it is really an appropriate symbol for our school in the year 2002 and beyond. People say it represents our heritage, and we should honor it and respect it. I am a native Southerner myself, as both of my parents are and all of their parents. And I do love much about the Southern culture, its openness and friendliness, its appreciation for the outdoors and natural...
Annie lays it all out. The history of racism in America from slavery to Jim Crow and how it still reverberates today at her school.
Although many of my friends are not racists and mean no harm by their support of the mascot, I have discovered that the Rebel is deeply troubling and offensive to all our African American students and their families. And this group includes some of my very closest friends. It is time for us to shed this unfortunate image of the past and to select a new mascot with positive imagery and associations. The plan to initiate this project is within the Student Council at CVS, but we will need the support of the community in order to be successful in achieving this positive change. Annie McLaurin, 8th grader, Cullowhee Valley School.
Annie's letter ran, and the reaction was immediate.
The first response was a response of support, which was really exciting. But then the negative pushback started coming out, and so other strongly worded letters in the newspaper, parents having strong opinions that they then, give to their children, and their children coming to school and fighting with me about why are you doing this? So I remember, heated debates with classmates, but also administrators in the school system.
And then I have a very visceral, vivid memory of receiving a phone call to our house phone one day that dates me pretty hard. And it was for me, and I remember taking the call in my parents' bedroom for some reason, and it was an older man who told me that he had a shotgun and he knew where I lived and that I better stop. And that was scary. That was really scary. Scary enough that Annie left. She enrolled in a boarding school in Pennsylvania and later went to college in Washington, D.C. It wasn't until she had a child that she thought about returning back home to Cullowhee, where she now teaches at Western Carolina University. And that child? They went to Cullowhee Valley School, still home of the Rebels. That is until 2020. the murder of George Floyd, and a conversation that began, of course, on Facebook.
So those conversations are happening about like, what do we do? What can we do in our community? And somebody brought up, why is the rebel still the mascot at Kelly Valley? And they dig up this story from years before and reached out to me.
18 years after she wrote the letter that led to her leaving town, Annie Wilson was the face of changing the rebel mascot again. But this time, she wasn't a child and she wasn't alone.
We get several hundred people that are supporting this change and trying to figure out like, okay, what do we do? And there's so much organization and support, which was really cool.
They did outreach. They started a GoFundMe. They met with the principal. Everything pointed in one direction, the school board.
Then we started communicating with the school board so that we could get on the schedule for the school board. And so I would say from the time that we created the Facebook group to the time that we were able to present to the school board, it was probably about 8 months.
Annie may have waited 18 years, but she finally had her moment to make the case.
Ultimately, it goes in front of the school board, and we just kind of forced a vote after making our presentation and our pleas. There was a couple of school board meetings where they were getting input from the community and things like that. And then ultimately, when it was voted, it was a unanimous vote to replace it.
That's right, listener. The Cullowhee Valley Rebels are now, as of June 2nd, 2021, the Cullowhee Valley Wolves. It really can happen.
I was a lady rebel. Like, what does that even mean?
The Boone County Rebels will stay the Boone County Rebels with the image of...
It's right here in black and white in print. Be my image.
Bigger than a flag or mascot.
Anytime you're trying to mess with tradition, you have to be ready for serious backlash.
From Ninth Planet Audio, I'm Akilah Hughes, and this is Rebel Spirit, Episode 6, Other Rebels. There was a point where I thought Boone County High School was unique in their rebel name. I actually couldn't have been more wrong.
There's South Great Neck High School, South Great Neck, Long Island. In 1984, they had a Confederate flag on the side of their football helmet. So,
if you want to know all there is to know about schools that have used the Rebels name, there is no better person to talk to than Dr. Caleb Smith.
Briarfield Academy in Lake Providence, Louisiana is a good example of that. Humphreys Academy in Belzoni, Mississippi is another one like that. I just went blank. There's several. Hickory Flat in Mississippi, George County, Mississippi, Harrison Central.
There are so many rebel schools that it's hard to keep straight. Dr. Smith should know. He wrote his dissertation on the rebel name in high schools. Its title, The Rebel Made Me Do It, Mascots, Race, and the Lost Cause. Get him started, and he doesn't stop.
There's a school in Texas called Evadale. And Evadale is probably the most egregious of the rebel schools that I know. Their school emblem is the Confederate battle flag. It got so bad that Google actually pulled their school website for being a hate speech site because of that image of the Confederate battle flag. Highland High School in Hardy, Arkansas is one that comes to mind, that they had on one side of the sign was an American flag and on the other side was a Confederate flag. There was an instance, and I love this story, in Kirkland, Washington. Juanita High School was built in the early 70s, and they decided they were going to do an experimental type of educational system with really short periods of classes and really a varied from the norm. So from that, they decided to call themselves the Rebels. And they even adopted like an eagle as their image, even though they were called the Rebels. So it really rebels against everything. But by 1985, there's a Confederate flag on the front of their yearbook.
Yeah, it seems like all roads for rebel lead to Confederate crap. Before we get to the Confederate crap, how about a quick trip through mascot history with Dr. Smith?
Colleges had the first real mascots that we can really identify. You can go all the way back to Harvard having theirs and Yale having theirs is the earliest. But schools develop mascots for lots of different reasons. Sometimes it was just a typo in the newspaper, or some sports editor said, well, this team, they were really mean looking and they looked like a Crimson Tide because of the way they attacked the field. And so that's where we get a lot of our mascots from. So then high schools in the 1930s and 1940s start developing their own mascots, and most of the time they duplicated what they saw. Schools are short funded, and so they decide, well, we're going to use what Louisiana State University uses as a tiger, or Notre Dame, we're the Fighting Irish, they're the Fighting Irish.
Right.
We begin to identify with these things in the 1950s. By the 1950s, most high schools were tigers or hawks or something that had a symbol that the students could bond around, and maybe a banner or some sort of image.
But something else happened in the 1950s that suddenly brought a new mascot name to high schools.
Oh, across the South, it's got to be Brown versus Board. In the mid-late 50s, right after Brown, and that's mainly public schools, and they're trying to get across that I know the feds have said that they want to integrate, but we are a new school that has to at least do something to save money, because we have this dual system, and the dual system was separate but definitely unequal. And so what school districts and cities and states decided to do was, instead of being separate but unequal, if we make the African American accommodations comparable to the white ones, they're less prone to want to integrate. And so let's merge all the white schools in our county or in this area and form a new school. And then we'll do the same thing with the black schools in our county or in our city. And so from that, we'll have separate and equal, and there'll be less want to try to integrate the schools. And so the white schools would merge together, and they would become the Rebels of Boyle County, or whichever county it was.
Now, the Rebels name that became popular in the 1950s, just as integration was happening, didn't come from nowhere. Like Dr. Smith says, most of the time, high schools just duplicated what they saw. And what high schools in the South saw was Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi, and their mascot, Colonel Reb, the original big mustache Confederate mascot character.
There's a lot of duplicates of the Colonel Reb.
One place that there's not a duplicate of Colonel Reb anymore, the actual University of Mississippi.
And in 2002, they finally did something with their old Colonel Reb mascot, the Confederate one, and migrated to a bear in 2008, and now they're a land shark of all things.
That's right. In 2002, Colonel Reb went away in Mississippi. They are now inexplicably represented by Tony the Land Shark. Ole Miss, however, still goes by the Rebels. So does the university with the second most famous Rebel mascot, the University of Las Vegas.
1980s and 1990s, the University of Nevada, Las Vegas were the running Rebels, and they were super popular. They went to, I think, the Elite Eight, like 5 out of 6 years. Larry Johnson, Stacey Ogman, I think, were on those teams.
This is Terry Borning from MascotDB.com. We spoke with him last episode about the 252 historical and current Rebel mascots around the country. Terry is originally from Minnesota, where his high school merged with another to form, you guessed it, the Rebels. His sister was at the school when it happened.
She remembers Rebels being, or the running Rebels of UNLV being a big factor, and they ultimately decided. And I noticed that quite a bit in Minnesota. Like, there's a lot of Rebels teams from Minnesota. So that's one other cultural phenomenon that I noticed.
Why did Nevada, a state that supported the Union cause, have any school with a Rebel mascot? The short story is that there was a public university in Reno, and they created a new site in 1957 in Las Vegas. In 1968, they wanted to separate themselves from the Northerners to create UNLV. So they called themselves Rebels. The Northern school had a wolf mascot, so they originally had a wolf mascot in a Confederate soldier uniform. That Confederate wolf was retired in the 80s and became Hey Reb. At this point, you can probably imagine what he looked like. Big mustache, big hat. The gray coat was exchanged for more of a Davy Crockett fringe leather number. But you get the drift. Just as an aside, if you remember back to the letter Judy Dethridge wrote to the Cincinnati Enquirer, she cites the UNLV's Hey Reb as the inspiration for her husband to create Mr. Rebel at Boone County High School. Following the racial justice uprisings of 2020 and an outcry around UNLV's Confederate-inspired mascot, Hey Reb was retired in 2021. And in case you're like, wow, so they confronted their racist past, this is what's on the UNLV website as of 2024. UNLV's nickname dates to the university's origin in the mid-1950s, a time when a nation founded by rebels once again became obsessed with the idea of the iconic nonconformist. The decade of the 1950s was epitomized by young people rebelling against their parents' middle-class American values, from popular motion pictures such as 1953's The Wild One, starring Marlon Brando, and 1955's Rebel Without a Cause, starring James Dean. Listener, James Dean did not die for this. We'll be right back. While Hey Reb went away in 2021, UNLV, like Ole Miss, are still the Rebels. Most every Rebel school you look at is either a knockoff of Ole Miss's Colonel Reb or UNLV's Hey Reb, or some combination of sabers and Civil War hats. But once you really start looking, you start noticing the academies with fancy crests sporting the name Rebel.
When I was doing some of the research, especially for the South, I found there were some in the 1950s and 1960s. There's a lot of academies that use rebels as a mascot. And when I did some research on them, they are called segregation academies, which is kind of shocking. It is basically these private charter schools that when the civil rights said that we need to integrate public schools, these charter schools were exempt from that.
Into the 1960s, it becomes evident that the states and the school districts will have to integrate. It's realized, oh no, there's no way that we can actually persist with this separate but equal, however you want to call that, of a setup. And so then they start moving kids to private schools, especially in the deep South. We'll see Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana start constructing these white flight academies from 68 to about 72. And their hardline stance was, we are forming just for white people. And if you are not white, you cannot come to this school. And here is our sign to you, this Confederate rebel on the door saying, you cannot come into this school.
So a number of these charter segregation academies still exist, and they might have, like a couple of students that are able to pay the tuition to come in, but they're still predominantly white kids that are going there. And those, surprisingly, well, maybe not surprisingly, when I did my research, there's a lot of these academies that still have rebels as their mascot.
Like Riverdale Academy in Coushatta, Louisiana, that still has a physical mascot, a Mr. Rebel character with white mustache and hat. This school gained notoriety during a 1970 congressional hearing for its ties to the broader issue of public support for these private academies. These academies received benefits such as discounted school buildings, free buses, and donated textbooks at the expense of public funds. In 1970, the county where Coushatta is located was 42% black, and all these resources were going to one private school. The term rebel in this context isn't about creativity or nonconformity. It means diverting resources from black students to maintain white-only institutions. Another example, John Hancock Academy in Georgia was established a year after a single black student enrolled at Sparta High School. It still exists today with the Rebel mascot, using the Ole Miss Colonel Reb logo. On their website is the following statement. At this particular time in history, when political correctness is so prevalent, we must stand firm or against worldly influences and point our young people toward the truth of God's word. More so now than ever before, it's time to stand up and be a rebel.
And it's linked to power. It's linked to this reminder of, remember who's in charge. It's our people who are in charge, not your people.
Sometimes you have to fight the power, and lawsuits around rebel mascots date back to 1970, when black students in Muncie, Indiana, filed a class action lawsuit against the district, alleging racial discrimination in redistricting, busing, and in the use of the rebel mascot at Muncie Southside High School. The rebel, students said, was offensive, inflammatory, and discouraged black students from participating in extracurricular activities. The students lost because the court found that the majority of white students in favor of the rebel would have their First Amendment rights violated if the rebel name was removed, though they did agree that the Confederate imagery was offensive. And good policy, though apparently not a court of law would dictate its removal. Muncie Southside High School stayed the rebels until it was closed in 2015. Black students in Pensacola, Florida, filed a class action lawsuit 3 years later in 1973 at their high school, Escambia High School. And listener, strap in, because wherever you think this story's going, it's going somewhere else. Escambia opened in 1958 as an all-white school. Dixie was its marching song, and the Rebel was their mascot. Forced to integrate in 1969, there was simmering tension between the new black students and the hostile white ones that boiled over into violence in 1972. By July 1973, black students had gotten an injunction in U.S. District Court against the use of Confederate imagery at the school. The next school year, they were the Escambia Raiders, and everything could have probably been okay except the school board and white students appealed the ruling. And in 1975, the U.S. Court of Appeals overturned the district court ruling and left it to the school board to sort out, which they did in February 1976 when they held an election between the Raiders and the Rebels, and the Rebel name lost, which is when the white students on the losing side rioted. And over the course of 4 hours, 4 students were shot. 30 were injured. Over 100 windows in the school were smashed. Trophy cases, clocks, and water fountains were destroyed, and a water pipe flooded an entire wing of the school. By the end of the chaos, police had confiscated 2 truckloads of knives, chains, bricks, and clubs. The next day, 120 Klansmen rallied outside of town. In the following weeks, crosses were burned on school board members' lawns, and 2 people, a member of the school board citizen advisory committee and a state representative, had their homes burned down. All this over a mascot, which never came back. Escambia High School has been the Gators since 1978. Nothing gets as nuts as Escambia. I mean, okay, but the most impactful lawsuit around the rebel name came in 1985 in Fairfax, Virginia.
You have a case where the principal there realizes that there's a problem, that there are African Americans in the school who don't salute the flag or don't represent the flag, and this could cause real issues. Now, Fairfax was a more forward-thinking and progressive town in the 80s than most other places in the South. And so he bans the Confederate flag and bans Confederate imagery to try to put out the fire before it gets too big in the school.
Yeah.
And so from that case went all the way to the Supreme Court about the question of freedom of speech of the students compared to trying to prevent problems from occurring in an educational environment.
For law nerds, the case is Crosby versus Holsinger. Holsinger was the principal who took a stand against the Confederate imagery, and Crosby represents the white students who just want their rebel back. But unlike the previous 2 rebel cases where courts ultimately decided for the racist white students, this time the court found for the principal. The case was appealed because, of course it was, and it took 5 more years, but the decision came down in 1990, and the Confederate imagery, but not the name rebel, was ended in Fairfax. It would take another 19 years to drop the rebel name. Fairfax High School is now the Lions, short, and I'm not joking, for Rebel Lion. Rebellion. While there have been 3 court cases about the rebel name, the reality is that the courts aren't the main driver of change here.
Sadly, this is the bad part about this, is that those changes always occur when tragedy, especially a racially tinged tragedy, happens. Charleston, George Floyd, like we see these things over and over again, and that's when people kind of realize, whoa, oh wow, that was something serious. What exactly are we putting forth? And then it kind of starts fading away, and then we forget about it, and then something else will happen. And it's always tragedy that leads to these changes, which I hate that it happens that way, but that's just the nature of a lot of different things. The reason that we do a lot of the just passing laws or bills or whatever, usually some tragedy happens, and then we try to fix it after the fact. And so we feel responsible for trying to fix it, and this is what we do.
In researching this episode, you see a wave of attempts at ditching rebel mascots in the early 1990s, after the beating of Rodney King by the LAPD and the riots that followed the cops' not guilty verdict. Most of those attempts failed. You see more traction following the Charleston Church Massacre in 2015, and more momentum building following the white supremacist march and subsequent murder of Heather Heyer in Charlottesville in 2017. But it's the police murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd in 2020 that kicked off a significant wave of change, including Spencer's petition to change the Boone County Rebels, Annie Wilson's success at Cullowhee Valley School, and the end of the Quartz High Rebels in Antelope Valley, California.
Oh, man, who was I in high school? I was just a big lost goofball, I guess you could say, like unfinished clay.
This is Tyrus, Quartz Hill Rebel class of 1992. And Tyrus is complicated. Tyrus is a comedian, an actor, a professional wrestler. He wrestled in the WWE under the name The Funkasaurus. And Tyrus is also a Fox News contributor.
When we saw Trump speaking, we saw a guy speaking for the common man.
I would think a transgendered woman winning in the men's division would be just as powerful, if it would say more about equality than having to hop over to the women's division.
It just seems that these woke ambassadors always seem to miss the mark.
Everyone wants to get rid of the police. These ideas are wrong.
While most people we've talked to about Rebel mascots might be the type of person that Tyrus would rail about as a guest on Gutfeld, hell, I'm the type of person that Tyrus would rail about as a guest on Gutfeld. But there's something we can agree on. Don't go away. Tyrus was outspoken and supportive in 2020 when Quartz Hill moved from the Rebels to the Royals.
I was a history buff in U.S. History with my teacher, Mr. Ray. I wrote a paper about I was going to go to America early and warn the Indians.
Awesome.
So I'll start off with that. So and it was at that age where you become aware of everything, like Confederate flag, and we were rebels in terms of like we didn't fit in with the other schools. We were smaller. Everyone else had won before.
Yeah.
And we started winning, especially our football program, our basketball program. We were always great about taking leftovers and making it into something beautiful. And I always thought that was cool when you take something ugly and you refurbish it. The generals back in the day would not be thrilled with me, myself a rebel. So I kind of get it from that perspective. Is like it's ours now when we twist it and morph it.
The school, did they have that like Confederate general mascot?
I think they did, but I think we changed it. I think it was a dog.
And it's true. You go to check out the 1989 Quartz Hill High School yearbook, and painted on the side of the building is a Confederate flag with a Confederate soldier, saber, and all. Mind you, this is a school in Southern California. They removed their mascot also in the 90s. The fallout from Rodney King probably hit a little harder in SoCal, but they kept the Rebel name. Always the last thing to go, isn't it? This progression that Tyrus is describing, from a Confederate general to a dog to eventually the Royals, is one we've seen over and over. Even Boone County High School dropped the flag and dropped the general. They just haven't lost the name. It's enough of a pattern that Caleb can rattle it off in his sleep.
We see that multiple times that these, they'll first start addressing the Confederate nature, the Confederateness of mascots, that there are, plantation owners that fly a rebel flag that, look like an old Confederate general. They'll start getting rid of them, and then they'll just go to just the term rebels, or just the county schools like R or BC or whatever lettering, instead of using an actual image. Well, then people are like, well, great, we're the Flying G's now. There's not really an image we can use now because the name that we've been using is so hot button. We're just going to use M, which is our county name. And so that's what we're going to go with.
Boone County, they're just the letters B and C now. It's like there is a single playbook and they're just running through it. But enough about me and my high school. Let's get back to Tyrus and his.
It wasn't the environment to where somebody was using it with nefarious name. Like, it wasn't like, hey, rebels, shouldn't be no N-bombs on your team. There was none of that negativity coming from anywhere. So, And it wasn't prevalent in our cities and in our town and stuff. So, whereas the South, there'll be people who will be hanging a Confederate flag in their front yard and stuff. Mm-hmm. And I live in Louisiana. I still see it. But in California, you just didn't have that. So unless somebody really brought it up and brought it to everyone's attention, we don't need rebel football teams in California.
I don't think Tyrus and I probably agree on much, though his moves as the Funkasaurus were pretty good. But we do agree on this. The rebel name has got to go.
It's a word that unfortunately is forever staying, and we don't need it in high school. So, there's enough good stuff out there.
And then Tyrus brings up perhaps the simplest, most succinct, and powerfully persuasive argument against keeping the name of the Rebels that I have ever heard.
My question was always, why would we want to be the losing team? I just take all the other stuff out of it. We're rocking the team with the L.
Why would any school want to be associated with the losing team? Who chooses a loser for their sports mascot? Well, racists, I guess. But you all know that. Talking to Tyrus, talking to Annie Wilson, talking to Terry Boring and Dr. Caleb Smith, it's clear that change is possible even if it doesn't happen overnight. Though for my sake, I hope it doesn't take over a decade to get done at Boone County High School. And it gives me an opportunity to hope even fleetingly, and to ask,
is there a future without this crap?
Yes, there is.
Again, Dr. Caleb Smith.
And I'll go back to the state flag of Mississippi, because in 2001, we had an election where we voted on whether we wanted to keep the old Confederate battle flag on our state flag or not. And so in that election, it's like almost 2-1, we voted to keep the old Confederate flag. Mm-hmm. Well, fast forward 19 years, we had another vote in 2020, and in that vote, 2-1 in favor of a new flag. We see that the younger people who grow up in an integrated society, they go to school with people of other ethnicities and other races, that they're more willing to realize that maybe this whole thing is not about me and my race, or however you want to define that. And instead, let's see if we can include other people. Let's check our racism at the door and see if we can figure out, is this really a good symbol of everyone, of the people of this school district or county or state or whatever? So there is hope. Since like 1995, there have been 0 schools that have added a Rebel mascot. Yeah. So no school since 95 has said, you know what, of all the mascots we could choose, tigers and hawks and bears, we're going to go with the Rebel, because that one just seems really, no school has done that since 95. And so that shows a little bit of people at least being cautious of what is actually represented with what they use. We see from 2019 to 2021, there are almost 30 schools in the United States that dropped the term rebel because they realized this is a term we don't really want to deal with anymore. Yeah. So, if Mississippi can change its flag, it kind of shows you, whoa, if they're changing their flag, there's something really serious that we need to look at here and address this whole issue.
All these conversations really got me thinking, is it ever easy? What are the ingredients that somehow magically cause this change to happen in a way that is quick and met with excitement? Luckily, in our next episode, I think we've maybe found a beacon of hope in Denver South High School that shows us what is possible when there's a high-profile alumni, like an NFL player, who is willing to push for change, and school administrators who welcome it. Next week, we'll dive deep into the Denver South case study and how they were able to pull off something incredible. Rebel Spirit is a production of Ninth Planet Audio in association with iHeart Podcasts. Reporting and writing by me, Akilah Hughes. I'm also an executive producer and the host. Produced by Dan Sinker. Edited by Josie Azam. Our assistant editor is Jennifer Dean. Music composed by Charlie Sun. Sound design and mixing by Josie Azam. Our theme song is All the Things I Couldn't Say, performed by Busty and the Bass, courtesy of Arts and Crafts Productions, Inc. Our production coordinator is Kyle Hinton. Our clearance coordinator is Anna Sonnenschein. Production accounting by Dilpreet Singh. Additional research support from Janice Dillard. Executive producers for Ninth Planet Audio are Elizabeth Bakewit and Jimmy Miller. Special thanks to Jay Becker and the whole team at BLDG, the Florence Yalls, Amber Hoffman, Hillary Delaney, and Leslie Chambers. If you have a racist mascot at your high school, or are an alumni of a high school with a racist mascot and want to share your own experience, please email us at rebelspiritpodcast@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you.